The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the sprawling city park. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare weekends where the warmth of the season had drawn people out from their homes and into the fresh air. The park was alive with energy, families spread out on picnic blankets, children racing around the playground, and joggers weaving between trees with rhythmic ease. The faint hum of conversation mixed with the distant sound of a live band playing near the community stage. Food trucks lined the walking path, offering everything from sizzling burgers to colorful bowls of shaved ice. It was the kind of afternoon that felt almost idyllic, a moment of calm in the otherwise bustling life of the city. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the faint scent of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. For many in the park, this was just another simple Saturday, a chance to unwind, catch up with friends, and enjoy the day. In the midst of this everyday scene, one person sat quietly, blending in with the crowd but carrying a presence that few would understand at first glance. Darnell Hayes, the governor of the state, sat on a weathered wooden bench near the park's central fountain, his eyes engrossed in the pages of a book. A man in his mid-40s, his dark skin and close-cropped hair stood in sharp contrast to the white flowery pages he turned with steady fingers. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and dark jeans, no flashy attire, no distinguishing marks of his position, just an ordinary man reading a book in an ordinary park. His calm demeanor was the epitome of relaxation, and he didn't seem out of place at all. Despite his casual appearance, there was something about the way he carried himself that hinted at the weight of authority. It wasn't in the way he dressed or in the occasional glance he shared with passing strangers. It was in the stillness of his posture and the way he observed the park with a quiet wisdom, as if he were seeing more than just the crowd before him. For a moment, he seemed to disappear into the background, as if he were just another face among the countless others enjoying the weather. Yet, those who happened to notice him might have felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Perhaps they'd seen him in the news, or perhaps they were just caught by the depth in his gaze. As Darnell turned the pages, a low hum of activity surrounded him. Children laughed nearby, their voices echoing off the park benches. A mother gently tugged her son away from the ice cream truck, both of them chuckling as they joined a family gathering under the shade of a large oak tree. A jogger, focused and breathing heavily, passed by him with barely a glance. Life seemed to flow smoothly around him, unnoticed by the majority of those around him. But there were two men who did notice him. From the far side of the park, two uniformed police officers emerged from behind a food stall. Their patrol was routine, as it always was on busy Saturdays. But as their eyes scanned the crowd, their gaze fell upon Darnell. There was no immediate reason for alarm, no cause for concern. Yet, for reasons not yet clear, they paused, their attention lingering on the solitary figure of the black man on the bench. A brief exchange passed between them, a wordless conversation in the way their eyes locked and shifted from Darnell to each other. One officer nodded subtly, and both began walking toward him, their boots crunching against the gravel path. The air, once full of the relaxed hum of the park, suddenly seemed to grow a little thinner. The officers' movements weren't rushed, but there was a precision to them, a kind of quiet determination that suggested they were about to engage with someone they had already formed an opinion about. As they approached, Darnell never lifted his gaze from his book. He turned the page slowly, the faint sound of paper brushing against paper punctuating the quiet moments between him and the officers. To any observer, it seemed like a harmless scene, a man lost in his thoughts, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Yet something about the officers' posture suggested otherwise. They were surveying the park as if they were looking for something, someone. They moved with an air of authority, scanning the crowd until their eyes landed firmly on him. The tension, though not immediately obvious, began to build as the officers drew closer. There was a subtle shift in the park's energy, as if the gathering crowd sensed the change before it even became fully visible. The distant sounds of the community event seemed to fade slightly, swallowed up by the anticipation of what might come next. People continued going about their day, unaware of the brewing storm that was about to unfold in the most ordinary of settings. And then the officers stopped just a few feet away from Darnell's bench. One of them cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice firm but not yet unfriendly. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Darnell didn't look up immediately. Instead, he took a moment to let the question hang in the air before lifting his gaze slowly. His eyes met the officer's with calm acknowledgement, his face giving nothing away. The officer shifted slightly, his posture indicating a professional stance. Polite, but with a hint of expectation. Something told Darnell that this interaction wasn't going to be as casual as it seemed. "I'm just enjoying the park," Darnell replied quietly, his voice measured, almost nonchalant. He closed the book, as if the conversation was something he'd been anticipating for a while. The officer stared at him for a beat, his expression unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes. There was no immediate explanation for why this man, simply reading in a public space, had drawn the attention of the law. But it didn't matter. Something about Darnell's calm, unassuming presence seemed to challenge the officer's instinct to question, and so, with a slight shift in tone, the officer pressed on. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the park today," the officer continued, though the words seemed to hang awkwardly in the air, far less convincing than he had hoped. "We just need to verify you're not causing any trouble." Darnell raised an eyebrow but still didn't stand. His voice was steady, unshaken. "I'm not causing any trouble," he replied evenly. "I'm just sitting here, reading my book. Not sure how that's suspicious." The officer hesitated for a moment, seemingly caught off guard by the calmness of the response, but his partner, who had been silently standing by, took a step forward, his hand lingering just above his belt. There was something cold in his posture, something that made the tension in the air suddenly snap tighter, and that was when it started. The officer's presence loomed over the park like a shadow, breaking the tranquil rhythm of the afternoon. They weren't in a hurry, but the pace of their steps was deliberate, almost as if they were inspecting the crowd for something, or someone, that didn't belong. As they drew nearer to Governor Darnell Hayes, their eyes remained fixed on him, and it was clear, something about the way he sat there, calmly immersed in his book, had piqued their curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," the first officer said again, this time with a slightly more authoritative edge to his voice, almost as if he were performing a routine. The governor didn't respond immediately, keeping his gaze on the page, a slight frown forming as he turned another leaf. The officer repeated himself, more insistent this time. "Sir, can I ask what you're doing here? The park's for the public, but we've had some reports of unusual activity." Darnell paused, slowly marking his place with a finger before closing the book with a soft snap. His calm, almost unhurried motion contrasted with the officer's tense, waiting posture. He looked up, his eyes briefly meeting the officer's. "I'm reading a book, officer," he said evenly, his voice steady but neutral, as though the question itself was absurd. "Is there a problem with that?" The second officer, standing slightly behind his partner, exchanged a quick look. They weren't expecting this kind of response. The park was crowded, yet somehow it felt like this man, this black man, didn't fit the type they expected to see lounging on the benches, unnoticed. Something about him didn't sit right with them, even though by all appearances there was nothing wrong. The first officer pressed on, this time with a slight condescension. "Well, sir, we've got a lot of people in the park today. A lot of folks just enjoying the community event. You know, it's a pretty busy place. So, what exactly are you doing here? Sitting by yourself?" His eyes roamed over Darnell's relaxed posture, scanning him for something, anything, that might justify this encounter. The officer's tone wasn't loud, but there was an underlying impatience, as if Darnell's mere presence required explanation. "This is a family park, you know." Darnell's brow furrowed briefly, his lips pressing into a thin line, but his voice remained unshaken. "I don't see why that's a problem. I'm just here to enjoy my day like everyone else. I'm not causing any trouble." The second officer, still hanging back, exchanged a quick glance with his partner. He hadn't spoken yet, but there was a visible shift in his body language, a step forward, a tightening of his jaw. He was the more aggressive of the two, the one who seemed ready to escalate the situation at the slightest provocation. "So, you're telling us you're just here to sit?" he asked, his voice a little more dismissive now, as if the answer should have been obvious. Darnell's patience was starting to wear thin, but he kept his tone steady, almost conversational. "Yes, I'm sitting, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't make it sound like a crime to relax in the park." The officer's eyes narrowed, but there was no immediate response. Instead, there was a brief, uncomfortable silence as the officers exchanged a quick, unreadable look. The park around them seemed to hum with life, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the midst of it all. It was then that the tension took a sharp turn. "Sir," the first officer said, the words coming out clipped, "can I see some identification?" There was no immediate cause for this request, no clear suspicion, no overt reason. Just a question that seemed to hang in the air, as if it were the next logical step in their interrogation. The request was sharp, a demand rather than a polite inquiry. It was as if the officers were looking for any excuse to escalate this situation further. Darnell's gaze flickered to the officer's hand, which hovered just near his belt, as if waiting for a response that would justify more action. He didn't flinch. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his expression still cool. "I'm sorry, officer," he said slowly. "But is there a reason why you need to see my ID? I'm just sitting here reading a book. No one's bothering anyone." The first officer didn't answer immediately, but his partner took a step forward, his posture shifting into something more confrontational. His hand twitched toward his radio, though he didn't speak into it. The subtle threat was unmistakable. Darnell could feel the undercurrent of tension, the unspoken weight of racial profiling, something all too familiar to him. "I'm asking for your ID, sir," the second officer repeated, his tone now bordering on a warning. His patience was thinning, and there was no mistaking the irritation that began to bleed through his words. "If you don't have one, you'll need to leave the park. And if you don't, we'll have to issue a citation for trespassing. Or worse." His hand hovered a little closer to his sidearm, though he still made no aggressive moves. Darnell's face remained a picture of calm, but the stillness of the moment hung thick between them. He could feel the crowd around them growing more aware, sensing the shift in the air. He could see a few people glancing over at him, but they quickly turned away, unsure whether to get involved. The officers were moving slowly, but the danger in their stance was clear. Still, Darnell refused to be intimidated. He met their gazes with steady eyes, his voice never wavering. "I didn't realize reading a book in the park was a crime," he said, his words sharp and dry, a touch of humor cutting through the tension. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the ice for a split second. The officer who had been leading the questioning looked taken aback, his brow furrowing in confusion. The second officer, however, didn't even acknowledge the comment, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His hand never strayed far from his belt, and his eyes were locked on Darnell with an intensity that hinted at the real threat behind their words. Darnell gave the officer a slight, almost imperceptible smile, his lips barely parting. "Look, I'll be happy to show you my ID," he said, still composed. "But only if you can explain to me exactly why you're questioning me." Otherwise, I'll be leaving now. I'm not causing any trouble." The officers exchanged another quick look, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole situation might diffuse itself. But the tension had already reached a boiling point, and the spark of conflict was there, ready to ignite. "I'm not leaving until I know exactly what this is about," Darnell continued, his voice calm but firm. "You've been questioning me for no reason, and I've done nothing wrong." The first officer's lips pressed into a thin line, and the second officer took a deep breath, stepping closer. "That's enough," he said coldly. "If you don't leave now, you'll be arrested." The words hung in the air, the park suddenly feeling a little less like a sanctuary and a little more like a battleground. The tension in the air had thickened, almost palpable, as the officers stood face to face with Governor Darnell Hayes. What had started as a routine questioning, albeit one laced with unnecessary suspicion, was rapidly spiraling into something more dangerous. The crowd around them had grown in number, a curious, uncertain buzz filling the air as people glanced in their direction. The officers' voices, though still measured, were carrying more weight now, their commands feeling less like polite suggestions and more like demands. "All right, you need to leave now," the second officer growled, his hand tightening around the radio on his belt. "If you refuse to comply, you'll be detained for trespassing. Do you understand that?" Governor Hayes didn't flinch. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but his focus remained on the officers. "I'm not going anywhere, officer. I'm doing nothing wrong," he said firmly, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet authority that only someone who had seen the ugliness of power would understand. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not today. Not in front of all these people. The first officer, his patience stretched thin, took a step closer. There was a subtle shift in his body language, a signal to his partner that he was about to escalate the situation. In an instant, he reached out and grabbed Darnell's arm, trying to force him to his feet. It was a quick, jerky motion, an unwarranted show of physical force. The suddenness of it jolted the crowd, who had been quietly watching the exchange unfold. Darnell's body stiffened, but he didn't immediately react, his mind racing, assessing the situation with the calm precision that had served him throughout his life. He wasn't about to be dragged around like some common criminal. He was the governor. But in that moment, the officer's hand on his arm felt like a symbol of everything he had fought against: the presumption of guilt, the assumption of non-compliance, and the casual brutality of authority. "Let go of me," Darnell said evenly, his voice carrying across the stillness of the park. There was no sign of panic, no rise in his voice, just calm, steady defiance. The officer, however, didn't let go, his fingers tightening around Darnell's arm, pulling him up from the bench with more force than was necessary. The crowd had started to murmur now, some people backing away, others pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. The whispers began to ripple through the crowd, like a subtle undercurrent of disbelief. A few people began to shout, though the words were unclear, blending into the rising tension. "You need to stop resisting, sir," the officer barked, his grip on Darnell's arm still firm, though his words seemed forced, as if he were trying to justify his own actions. But Governor Hayes wasn't resisting. He wasn't even raising his voice. He was simply standing his ground, refusing to be moved, refusing to be treated as anything less than a man with dignity and rights. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the escalating chaos. "Wait, that's Governor Hayes," someone called out, a woman's voice, sharp and clear, ringing across the park. The officer froze. His hand, still wrapped around Darnell's arm, wavered. The second officer, who had been waiting for any excuse to escalate, paused as well. Both officers turned in the direction of the voice, as if the words themselves had physically pulled them away from the confrontation. The woman who had shouted stepped forward, pointing directly at Darnell. "That's Governor Darnell Hayes, the state governor," she repeated, her voice now tinged with confusion and disbelief. You're about to arrest the governor? For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The officers, who had been so certain in their actions, looked at each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock, then to outright embarrassment. They both took a step back, eyes darting between Darnell and the crowd, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Darnell remained composed throughout the entire exchange. His face remained calm, a picture of quiet resolve, though his mind was working quickly. He didn't need to reveal his identity for any reason, but there was something profoundly surreal about the moment, the absurdity of it, the crushing weight of the realization hitting both him and the officers simultaneously. The first officer pulled out his phone, fumbling with it as if in a panic. He searched for confirmation, his face going pale as he scrolled through the screen. His fingers moved clumsily, typing in a name, a title, a public figure, and in seconds, the truth was staring back at him. The governor's name, his face, his official title, everything was there. "Oh, my God," the officer muttered under his breath, his voice a mix of shock and shame. His grip on Darnell's arm loosened, then released entirely. He took a step back, visibly uncomfortable. The second officer, equally stunned, Darnell, ever the picture of grace under pressure, didn't even flinch at their reaction. He simply nodded, his voice calm as ever. "It's okay, officers. I understand the confusion. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He simply allowed them to process the information and face the consequences of their actions. The first officer was the first to speak, his words coming out in a jumble. We didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Governor Hayes. We didn't know who you were." "Obviously," Darnell replied dryly, his expression unreadable. The sarcasm was light but sharp, enough to cut through the tension. The second officer, now visibly flustered, muttered an apology as well, his face practically burning with embarrassment. "We didn't mean any disrespect, sir. We didn't recognize you." His words trailed off, and for a moment, neither officer knew what else to say. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, began to murmur among themselves. Phones were still raised, some people turning to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. The energy in the park had shifted dramatically, from tension and conflict to discomfort and awkwardness. The officers' faces were red with shame, and their previous bravado seemed to evaporate in an instant. Darnell didn't look at them. He simply gathered his things, the book, the bag resting on the bench, and stood still calm, still composed. "I'll be leaving now," he said, his voice even and steady. "But I think it's time for a little conversation about training and accountability, don't you?" The officers, their faces a picture of confusion and regret, nodded silently. There was nothing more they could say, nothing they could do to undo the mistake they'd made. As Darnell walked away, the crowd parted, some watching him with newfound respect, others still in disbelief at the absurdity of what had just occurred. The officers, now humbled and unsure of their next steps, remained where they were, their earlier sense of authority shattered by the simple truth they had missed. The park, once a place of calm, had been transformed into a reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary of moments, assumptions can make an entire world of difference. It didn't take long for the story to explode. The footage from the bystanders, captured from multiple angles, quickly found its way to social media. Within hours, it was everywhere. Headlines flashed across news outlets. "Police mistake governor for a common citizen and remove him from park." The video, showing the officers' escalating confrontation with a calm, composed Governor Darnell Hayes, spread like wildfire. The image of a black man, peacefully reading in a public space, being questioned and physically handled by police officers, stirred something deep within the collective consciousness. By the time the sun set, the city was buzzing with outrage. The viral footage had made its rounds on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. People shared the video with captions like, "This is what happens when you're black in America," or "What's the real crime here?" The narrative quickly took shape. A story of racial profiling, police misconduct, and the unfair treatment of black people by those meant to serve and protect. As the days went on, the fallout deepened. News anchors discussed the footage during prime time, the story dominating cable news channels. Political pundits weighed in on the incident, with some condemning the officers' actions and others defending them, citing the need for proper training in dealing with situations like these. A slew of think pieces appeared in major publications, each focusing on the implications of racial bias within law enforcement, particularly when it involved people of power like Governor Hayes. Social media was split. While many expressed outrage at the officers' behavior, there was also a large segment of people who sympathized with the officers, suggesting that the incident was a simple misunderstanding or that it was the result of a bad situation blown out of proportion. However, these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming wave of support for the governor and the growing demand for accountability. In the wake of the incident, the public reaction was swift and intense, with opinions falling along racial and political lines. On one hand, a sizable portion of the population rallied behind Governor Hayes, praising his measured, dignified response to an unjust situation. People who had seen the footage couldn't help but admire how calmly he handled himself. His refusal to raise his voice, to lash out in anger, and his decision to remain unflappable even as the situation escalated, stood in stark contrast to the aggressive actions of the officers. His demeanor reflected a grace under pressure that was not only admirable, but seemed to resonate deeply with the public. Many saw him as a role model, someone who had shown extraordinary restraint in the face of unnecessary hostility. "I would have lost it if that were me," one Twitter user wrote, echoing the sentiments of many others. "Governor Hayes is a better man than most. He showed us all what real leadership looks like." Others were struck by the fact that such an encounter could even happen to someone in such a high position. If it could happen to the governor, it could happen to anyone, they realized. This sparked a wave of conversations about racial profiling and systemic injustice. People began to ask themselves how many other black men, regular citizens without the status or influence of a governor, had been treated the same way by law enforcement. How many had been forced to endure similar treatment without the public's gaze upon them? On the other hand, there was a vocal group of people who sympathized with the officers, claiming that the situation was blown out of proportion. They suggested that the officers had been doing their job and that anyone, regardless of race, might have been questioned if they appeared to be acting suspiciously in a public park. "They just asked for ID. Big deal," some commentators argued. "It's not like they threw him to the ground." But those voices were a minority, and even within them, there was an uneasy acknowledgement that the officers had made a major misstep. Most of the support for the officers came from people who believed the confrontation could have been avoided if the governor had simply cooperated. But the more the incident was analyzed, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about one man's refusal to comply. It was about a pattern of behavior, a bias ingrained in how law enforcement officers interacted with people of color, and the assumptions they carried into their interactions with black men, even when those men held powerful positions. By the end of the week, protests had erupted in several major cities, with people marching in solidarity with the governor. They demanded not only accountability for the officers involved, but also for a larger national conversation about police reform, racial bias, and the everyday struggles that black Americans faced. The footage had become a symbol, an undeniable, real-time example of the systemic issues that had been bubbling under the surface for decades. Amidst the media frenzy, Governor Hayes made a brief but impactful public statement. It wasn't a fiery, emotional speech. It didn't contain hyperbole or inflammatory rhetoric. Instead, it was calm, measured, and dignified, the same tone he had maintained during the entire altercation in the park. Standing at a podium in front of his state's Capitol building, flanked by a handful of reporters and photographers, Governor Hayes began his address with a simple, straightforward message. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I'd like to start by saying that I've had time to reflect on the events of the past few days. I understand that this situation has sparked a lot of discussion. And while I am not angry about what happened to me personally, I am deeply concerned about what it represents." He paused, taking a breath. The weight of his words lingered. "As a public servant, I am well aware of the responsibilities that come with my position, but I am also well aware of the responsibilities that law enforcement has to uphold the law fairly and equitably for all people. What happened in that park wasn't just about me. It's about the reality that too many black men face every day, whether they are sitting in a park, walking down the street, or even sitting in their own homes. We are often assumed to be criminals, assumed to be dangerous, simply because of the color of our skin." There was a pause, a moment of silence, before he continued. "I've been in this position for a long time. I've seen a lot. But even I, with all my privilege and power, was not immune to the bias that still exists in some corners of law enforcement. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this because it's time for us to be honest about the fact that this experience, as upsetting as it was, is not uncommon. It is an experience shared by too many of our brothers, our fathers, our sons, and our friends. We cannot ignore this any longer." The governor's statement was not just an apology or a simple recounting of events. It was a call to action. His words carried a weight that reverberated beyond the incident itself. They spoke to a broader truth about systemic injustice and the urgent need for change. And as he finished, his words left an indelible mark on everyone who heard them. "I call on my colleagues in law enforcement," he said, "to acknowledge that bias exists, even within their own ranks. We must work to ensure that no one, regardless of their race or status, is treated with suspicion or hostility simply because of who they are. We must ensure that the law is truly applied equally, without exception." His tone was not one of anger, but of deep, unwavering conviction. He wasn't just calling for change. He was demanding it. The weight of his position made his words all the more powerful, and they carried across the nation. The media coverage continued for days, but the narrative began to shift. It was no longer just about a viral moment. It was about the deeper questions of systemic racism, the biases within law enforcement, and the need for reform. Governor Hayes' statement became a pivotal moment in the conversation, marking not only a personal victory for the governor, but also a step toward accountability for law enforcement and a future where such incidents might be less common. The fallout from the park incident was swift, and it wasn't long before the police department took action. With public pressure mounting, they had no choice but to launch an internal investigation into the actions of the two officers involved. The footage of the confrontation had gone viral, and the question of accountability loomed large. The calls for justice from the public were deafening. Everyone from local community leaders to national organizations decried the officers' behavior, highlighting the pattern of racial profiling and the abuse of authority that had played out so visibly in the park. The two officers were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, a move that came as both a relief and a disappointment to many. For some, it was a necessary step toward accountability, but for others, it was a stark reminder that real change in law enforcement would take more than just a few weeks of internal reviews and suspension. As the investigation progressed, pressure continued to build for full transparency. Advocacy groups, citizens, and public figures all voiced their desire for a clear and thorough examination of the officer's actions, along with a public report on the findings. The public outcry was a powerful reminder of the growing dissatisfaction with police departments that weren't held accountable for discriminatory behavior. The incident ignited a conversation about reform in the state legislature. While some lawmakers remained hesitant, others saw the tide of public opinion and felt the pressure to act. Discussions around police reform gained unprecedented momentum in the halls of the state capitol. Bills were introduced to address racial profiling, improve police training, and increase community oversight of law enforcement. The incident, while painful, became a catalyst for change, pushing the state to confront difficult but necessary conversations about the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Away from the public eye, in the quiet of his office late one evening, Governor Darnell Hayes sat alone, his fingers lightly tapping the surface of his desk. The world had seen his calm exterior during the park incident, and his dignified public statement afterward had solidified his position as a leader in the fight for justice. But now, in the stillness of the night, the weight of everything, the incident, the scrutiny, the pressure, began to hit him. He leaned back in his chair and let his thoughts drift. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and he allowed himself to think about what had really happened. That afternoon in the park, what had started as an ordinary day, one in which he sought a quiet moment away from the stresses of his office, had turned into an overwhelming reminder of how deeply ingrained racism and bias still were in society. A flash of memory flickered before his eyes, a younger version of himself, sitting in a classroom as a boy, hearing the whispers of classmates who assumed he was a troublemaker just because of the color of his skin. The incident in the park hadn't been the first time he had faced such assumptions. As a teenager, he'd been followed around in stores. As a young man, he'd been stopped by police for questioning far too many times. It was a harsh reality that black men had to navigate, no matter their accomplishments or station in life. Yet, despite all of this, he had risen. He had reached the highest office in the state. He had earned the respect of his colleagues, and yet still, this country, this system, found ways to remind him of his place. Governor Hayes closed his eyes, pushing the painful memories aside for a moment, focusing on the present. What mattered now was what came next. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone else who faced this kind of treatment. People who didn't have his platform, his power. They were the ones he needed to fight for now. In a quiet voice, almost as if speaking to himself, he said aloud, "I can't let this go. I can't let it be just another moment." There was a silence in the room, but within him, a new resolve was taking root. He had the power to make change, to push for reform in ways that others could only dream of. The stakes were higher now, because it wasn't just about policing. It was about the very soul of the state he governed, and the nation at large. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legislative meetings, press conferences, and late-night strategy sessions. Governor Hayes made it clear that the incident in the park had become a turning point, not just for him, but for the state as a whole. In a series of speeches across the state, he called for stronger accountability in law enforcement, the implementation of more rigorous training on racial bias, and the introduction of policies that would ensure law enforcement treated all citizens equally, regardless of race, background, or social status. At home, in quieter moments with his family, he shared his thoughts with his wife, Carla, and their children. They had always known that their lives were shaped by his work in public service, but lately, it felt different. The stakes had shifted. The conversation wasn't just about politics. It was about something much more personal. "You know, it's not just about the legislation we're pushing for," he told Carla one evening, sitting together on the porch, looking out at the horizon. It's about showing my kids that their dad is fighting for a world where they can walk into any park, any store, any office, and be treated like anyone else. Carla, ever the steady voice of reason, nodded thoughtfully. But it won't be easy. It never is. There will be pushback. You'll face resistance. But you've always known how to fight for what's right, Darnell. And you've shown the world how to keep your head up, no matter how hard it gets. Governor Hayes smiled at her, grateful for her support. I've had to be strong for them, for all of us. But I won't stop until this state is a place where people don't just look at you and assume you're a criminal because of the color of your skin. The weeks turned into months, and the investigation into the two officers continued to unfold. Ultimately, the officers were not fired, but they were required to undergo retraining, and their records were marked with disciplinary actions. It was a step in the right direction, but many, including Governor Hayes, knew that this wasn't enough. The real work was still ahead. Then came a moment that lightened the atmosphere, a public event where Governor Hayes was invited to speak to a group of local leaders. The mood in the room was more relaxed than usual, with laughter and small talk filling the space. One of the event organizers, trying to ease some of the tension from the media coverage, joked, "Governor Hayes, I think we'll need to give you a VIP pass for every park in the state now, just to avoid any more misunderstandings." The room erupted into laughter, and even Governor Hayes couldn't help but chuckle. The humor was infectious, and for a brief moment, it lightened his heart. It was a reminder that, while the road ahead was challenging, there was still room for hope, for progress, and even for a little levity. "I'll take that VIP pass," he said with a grin. "I'm sure it'll come in handy next time I just want to read a book in peace." The laughter that followed was genuine, and it was a reflection of how far he had come, how far they had come. Governor Hayes had learned in the most difficult of ways how to balance dignity with resilience. This incident, though painful, had given him a deeper understanding of the fight ahead. But it had also fueled his determination to create lasting change, not just for him, but for everyone who had been overlooked, mistreated, or misunderstood. The journey was far from over, but now he knew that the struggle, though long and difficult, was one worth fighting. And as he left the event that evening, the weight of the past few months seemed a little lighter, with the knowledge that he was not alone in this fight. He had the people on his side, and more importantly, he had a vision for a future where equality wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. And that, he thought, was a fight he could win. As the weeks turned into months, the echo of the incident in the park began to fade from the headlines, but its impact on Governor Darnell Hayes remained indelible. More than just a politician, Hayes had become something of a cultural icon, an embodiment of resilience, grace under pressure, and unwavering commitment to social justice. His calm and dignified handling of the confrontation in the park had shown the world that strength wasn't always about loud defiance or fiery speeches. It could also be about standing firm in the face of adversity with quiet resolve. In a world so often dominated by conflict and division, his approach had offered a rare moment of clarity and purpose. But what really set him apart wasn't just how he had handled that single moment of crisis. It was what he had done in the aftermath. The calls for reform, the deep and thoughtful conversations about racial justice, the commitment to using his position not just for political gain, but for true, meaningful change. Hayes had taken a moment of personal injustice and turned it into a clarion call for fairness and equality. His leadership had set a new standard for what it meant to be an advocate, not just for one's own community, but for everyone who faced the brunt of systemic inequities. Months later, Governor Hayes found himself walking through that same park again. This time, the scene was a little different. There was no tension hanging in the air, no ominous presence of law enforcement eyeing him suspiciously. Instead, the park felt peaceful, almost vibrant, with families enjoying picnics, children laughing as they ran past, and the gentle hum of everyday life playing in the background. It was, for the most part, a place of serenity, a stark contrast to the chaos and discomfort that had marked his previous visit. As he walked slowly along the path, his mind wandered back to that afternoon, the way things had spiraled, the crowd's growing awareness, the moment when his identity had been revealed. It had been a defining moment, but it was also a painful reminder of how far the country still had to go. But now, as he passed by a family enjoying a picnic, or a jogger waving as they passed, he realized something important. The park itself was a symbol of both the struggle and the progress that had been made. It represented the journey from division to unity, from suspicion to understanding. The same park that had been a site of tension had now become a space of possibility. Governor Hayes paused by a bench where, not so long ago, he had been forced to explain his right to simply exist in a public space. He smiled to himself. That same park, which had once been an arena for misunderstanding, was now an emblem of hope. Hope that even the most casual spaces, the ones we take for granted, could become sites of transformation if people were willing to fight for them. His steps slowed as he glanced around, absorbing the tranquility of the moment. He wasn't just a man walking through a park. He was a person who had lived through something profound, someone whose actions had helped spark a conversation that would continue to shape the future of his state, and perhaps the nation. His path had not been an easy one, but it had been an important one, and it was far from over. As Governor Hayes continued his walk through the park, he thought about the future. The path ahead was still long, fraught with challenges and obstacles. But he had learned something vital over the past few months. Change doesn't happen because of one big moment, one singular victory. Change happens when people commit to doing the hard work every day, when they stand firm in their beliefs, speak out when they see injustice, and act with dignity, even when faced with the most difficult of circumstances. His role in the park incident had shown him that progress doesn't always come with immediate results. It wasn't about being right in the moment. It was about creating the conditions for long-term change, asking the hard questions, demanding accountability, and showing others that change was possible, even when it seemed unlikely. The struggle for justice was not always about dramatic victories. Sometimes it was about the quiet moments, the moments of reflection, the moments of understanding, the moments when individuals chose to make a stand and hold on to their integrity in the face of hardship. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange light across the park as Governor Hayes approached the spot where the incident had unfolded. He stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over him. A soft breeze stirred the leaves of the trees above, and in that moment he knew something profound. His journey, while still ongoing, had already begun to shape the future. What had begun as an unfortunate incident had morphed into a powerful catalyst for change. The governor had already accomplished so much, not just by confronting injustice head-on, but by using his platform to encourage others to do the same. The park, a symbol of public space, had now become a symbol of transformation. A place that once divided had now united a community in the pursuit of fairness and equality. As he walked out of the park, surrounded by the hum of everyday life, he realized that the future was shaped by people who chose to stand firm in the face of injustice, to speak out, and to act with dignity, no matter the odds. The road ahead would not always be smooth, and the fight for true equality would take time, but Governor Hayes was more determined than ever to see it through. The park, once a place of tension and suspicion, now stood as a testament to the possibility of progress. It was a symbol of the quiet, unwavering power of hope, and of the belief that change, no matter how slow or difficult, was always worth fighting for. And as he walked away, the sounds of laughter and children's voices echoing in the distance, Governor Hayes knew that the future, though uncertain, was something he could help shape. It was a future where equality was not just an ideal, but a reality. The fight for that future, he realized, was not just his, it was everyone's, and together they could make it happen.